Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and spending some time with me. Today's episode, I haven't done one of these, and actually, I'm not sure the last time I talked to somebody about their personal story. It's actually one of my favorite things to do on the show, and sometimes I get people coming in with that, and then sometimes it's really hard for me to find anyone who's actually willing to come on and share about their journey around sex, especially when it's had struggles, right, and that they have overcome or are overcoming. And today is one of those shows. So Alba is joining me to talk about what she's calling a triggered life. Her early trauma, childhood trauma that was ongoing and pretty severe, and the impacts that had on her as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, and how she's stepping into her voice and her power now in a happy marriage with children. And, she's come out the other end, not like this is all behind her, because she shares in the episode, she still gets triggered. It's not like that's behind her, but she's able to speak to it now. She's able to set boundaries and take care of herself. And so that's been really life-changing. So I hope you are moved by her willingness to share what happened to her and how this has been. And I hope you find it inspiring, whether you've had trauma or not. It's an incredible story. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So thank you so much for being on the show with me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, when somebody comes on and shares their personal story, I kind of like to start at the beginning. So what was your first encounter with intimacy, and then how has that impacted your relationship with your body, with sexuality?
So that actually goes a little bit farther back than I would like to remember.
Oh.
My first encounter with intimacy was before I was 5. So it was about at the age of maybe 3 or 4 years old.
Oh, wow.
And it was at the hands of family members in form of molestation. Oh. And it is something that for about 4 years of my life after that, I could not even recall anything that had happened during that time. So it was a memory that had been erased, but yet I was dealing with the consequences of it, meaning I had people-pleasing behaviors, which I was super addicted to. So I had certain addictive patterns in terms of coping skills that I had as the aftermath or the effect of my trauma. And it wasn't until I was 9 years old when my uncle came from the Dominican Republic. So my origin is in the Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. And I came here when I was 5. And it was in a sense a liberation for me, because I was being liberated or removed from my abusers.
Because that was happening in the Dominican Republic.
Yes.
Okay.
And then when I came here, it was as if I was starting a whole new life as a quote unquote good girl. Mm. And the first time that I was reminded of my abuse was when my uncle had come in from the Dominican Republic. And when he came in and he gave me that smile, that look, my body remembered what had happened to me.
Wow.
And I was filled with shame, guilt, and embarrassment at that point. And in my culture, the way you greet family members is always with a hug and a kiss on the cheek.
Mm-hmm.
So it was expected that I would have to give him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. So I had to embrace my abuser, and I had to confront it as if nothing had happened. And that to me was the beginning of my silence that was killing me on the inside. So as far as how it kind of shaped the way I was relating to my body and intimacy, was that was around the time when I began my second addiction or coping skill, which was that of masturbation. And it was something that at first it was like this cycle of shame and guilt and feeling like it was my fault and feeling out of control or out of my body, because I was having these flashbacks, which would mostly happen at night. When I would go to sleep, I would have dreams about it. And I would have this feeling of desire, and I didn't know where it came from, but it only made me feel as if, yeah, of course you are guilty, because if you weren't guilty, you wouldn't be feeling this feeling that you're having. And then the one way to regain control would be to masturbate, to, in essence, like come back to my body, which would only make the guilt even worse. So it was like a vicious cycle.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. You said something about moving here to be a good girl. Had you gotten messages before that about being a bad girl? That's sort of where my mind went when you said that.
So when I think about my life as a child, and I didn't quite have a childhood that I could remember at that time.
Right.
Because all I could remember was the negative. So I couldn't recall, playing with dolls or having tea time or doing the things that a normal child would do. All I could remember was my abuse. So I had this sense of selective memory at that time before my memory was taken from me. That's all I could remember. So I felt that guilt. I carried that guilt with me. And that was what made me identify with being a bad girl. It's like, and then when I came here, it was the idea of pleasing others so that they could see that I'm not a bad girl, that I'm a good girl.
Right. And so it sounds like the rest of your family did not know that this had been going on.
So that's hard to say. I'd like to say no, but the reality is that it was happening very often and to more than just one person. And as a adult and as a parent, I feel like there's a certain level of awareness that happens when a child is robbed of their innocence. And I can tell, more so because I'm hypervigilant because of my abuse. But I know that there's a certain level of knowing that goes on. And because it happened to multiple people, it makes me wonder.
Yes.
How much did they know? Because it happened within the family, how much of it was a protective mechanism to protect the family or the name of the family per se. But I don't actually know who or if anyone knew. I just could only speculate from my adult perspective.
So when your uncle showed up when you were 9, was that to move here and now he's back a part of your life, or was that just a visit?
Nope. He moved here and he was back to be a part of my life. And the interesting part is that was only the beginning of my flashbacks. That was only the beginning of my journey to remembering my abuse, because it started off with picture, picture, picture. And then it started becoming like video recordings, and I started to piece more things together. And I recognized and realized it was more than one person in these pictures.
Oh.
And realizing that it was more than one person, I was the common denominator. So again, it was back to, it's your fault. You attracted it because it was you and these people. So, and these people are family. So how could you do something like that? And it only made me even more silenced about it because I felt guilty, and I felt like if anyone knew what I had done, what would they think of me, or what would they say about me?
Yeah.
So it only made the silence even more, like I really needed to just keep this to myself. And slowly but surely, the other members of the family started coming to the United States as well.
Oh, gosh.
And the way I would describe it, it was as if my life was like a war zone walking through landmines. And at any point, a knock on the door could be another trigger to my trauma in a form of a family member. And I wouldn't know until I opened the door. And I sometimes wouldn't even know by the look. Sometimes it would be the embrace. Sometimes it would be, something else that would tell me like, oh, this was one of them. Because it wasn't always clear to me. Because like I said, it was like coming to me in bits and pieces.
Right. You're recovering memories that had gotten whatever, repressed or lost or, right? So you're trying to piece something back together.
Mm-hmm.
It also sounds like maybe they didn't have the same access to you to continue the abuse.
I was living with my father at this time, and no, they didn't have the same access to me. That wasn't the end of my abuse. It did continue in different occasions, but it was more so isolated events as opposed to an ongoing thing as I was, growing into a young girl and an adolescent, which definitely shaped me even more so. Again, it's like, it's your fault, and almost like this hypersexualization at a young girl, and not really understanding what that all meant. And also being in a culture where typically boys will be boys. And girls tend to be the ones that are mostly considered at fault if something is found out. It's more and that's something that I don't know if it's particular to my culture in per se, but it's like for a young boy to be interested in a girl, it's like, oh, that's nice, he's going to be a manly man one day, or he's going to be this. Whereas a girl doing something very similar, it's like, no, that's frowned upon. You can't do that. That's not okay.
Right.
So it's those same type of stereotypes that we have towards boys and girls that makes it so. Some of these patterns that continue on from starting from trauma at a young age, and then continuing on as a adolescent and a teenager, when these patterns continue, oftentimes the victim is blamed.
Yeah, and you're describing, what to me can only be described like a nightmare. Like it's terrorizing. Who knocks on the door, what's going to happen? So frightening. And I'm imagining that beyond the masturbation and the hypersexualization, that you would have been having a ton of anxiety or other kinds of what I might consider a symptom as a therapist. Like, it seems to me there would have been all kinds of signs potentially, or struggles that you would have been having as a young girl.
The interesting part about it is that the way my trauma manifested was definitely in people pleasing, which is a very nicely disguised, normal, quote unquote, not normal at all, manifestation of trauma.
Right.
So that ended up translating to me wanting to be a good girl at home, and anything that I was asked to do, I would do.
Yeah, so from the outside, you just look like a good girl. On the inside, I'm imagining tremendous anxiety and fear, and there
was a significant contrast, to say the least. I lived a double life.
Yeah.
Meaning what I felt on the inside and what I portrayed on the outside were two different things.
Yeah.
I would rely on school to be my outlet. And again, back to the people pleasing behavior. I was wanting to be a good student, wanting to get good grades, wanting to get praise and accolades from my teachers. And that is how I was able to survive through my traumatic days. It wasn't until I became an adult that I realized that trying to please everyone is setting yourself up for failure, and that it was also the way I was running away from my traumatic experience or coping with my trauma. But at the time, I was just surviving. And if I were to look back and have a conversation with that young girl, I'd be like, you did a damn good job. Like,
yeah. In a lousy situation with no resources really.
Yeah.
Or support, Yeah.
In all aspects, I just feel like all of these many different coping mechanisms that exist, that we as resilient trauma survivors endure, and participate in, are good, even though society may not necessarily accept some versus others. I feel like they're all in the same basket in terms of coping and surviving. For example, I talk very loosely about the word addiction. So right now, aside from being a certified trauma life coach, I'm also a nurse that works in addictions. And the way I see addictions, the way I understand addictions, is that addiction is not, like, a drug is not the gateway drug to another drug, meaning marijuana is not the gateway drug. Alcohol is not the gateway drug. Trauma is the gateway drug.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what happens with society is that we try to label what is, a positive addiction versus what is a negative addiction, meaning a substance use disorder is considered a negative addiction because it has more so negative consequences, whereas someone who's addicted to work or addicted to people pleasing or addicted to has these positive addictions or these negative addictions, because it could be neutral, it could be school. I mean, not school. It could be food. It could be sex. It could be, coffee. It could be some of the things that are somewhat normalized, but not, there's a spectrum, right? And when you look at addiction, it's simply a way of coping with the trauma. Right. And it's because the person who experienced the trauma wants to survive another day, but they can't handle this internal pain. So they simply want to numb that internal pain to live another day. And the way I see it is that trauma saves more lives than it takes, because it allows that person to continue to live, as opposed to live in that internal suffering, which can lead to a person not wanting to live anymore. Right. And when you look at someone who has all of these accolades and all of these things that they have achieved in life, and they're dealing with this internal suffering, when something happens, people are like, well, why did that person do that? They had this and they had that and they had this and they had that. But all of those things were addictions to deal with this pain that happens on the inside. So for me, I think that it's important to understand that any form of addiction, whether positive, neutral, or negative, it should be recognized and acknowledged, especially if it's used to cover up some kind of trauma that was experienced, because that internal suffering, that guilt, is what we all need that liberation from.
How did the trauma, the triggers, that experience then go on to shape your relationships as as you were getting to be a teenager, young adult? How was this manifesting in your life?
So now I have this what I consider this different thought pattern or brain waves that now have sexualized me to desire something that I'm not physically ready for. So it meant that in relationships as an adolescent, I was asking for things that I didn't realize that I didn't want. And it meant that I was putting myself in situations that were, again, re-traumatizing and triggered. And I didn't realize that it had to do with the trauma. I didn't realize where the root cause was. I couldn't understand. I didn't have the capability to understand how one thing led to another.
Yeah.
So I was simply going on impulse. I was going on these visuals that I had in my head, and these dreams that I would have, and this feeling that I had, and I was going with it. And it was challenging because I found myself in quite a few situations that I couldn't talk my way out of.
Mm.
And it only made me feel that sense of voicelessness, that sense of powerlessness that I was in as a child. Because now I was here. And again, it's like, it's your fault. You asked for it.
Oh, wow. Hey everybody, it's Jessa, and we're just taking a little break in the show so I can share something exciting with you. At least I think it's exciting. You know, I wrote a book called Sex Without Stress, and I had turned it into an online course, and now I've reformatted it so that you can sign up at any time. It's more like an a la carte thing. For less than $100, you and your partner can work through this entire process, guided through webinars and assignments and conversations to have and real-world exercises to use to take the stress out of your sex life. So if you're in a good relationship but sex is the issue, this could be a perfect fit. And then separate from that, you can opt into my membership group, month at a time, or you can sign up for a whole year. That's where you'll get the personal support while you're working through the process. So it comes with Q&A sessions, bonus content, some guest presenters, and a private support community, like a forum. So that's priced separately so you can just participate in that when it's useful to you. Anyway, if you want to learn more, go to sexwithoutstress.com. And now back to the show. So how have you gotten back your voice and your power? You know, how did you go from this life that's mired in coping mechanisms, and I don't even know quite what to call it, but that sort of seeking that wasn't serving you? Like, how did you go from there to where you are now?
So, interestingly enough, my trauma has been my greatest teacher in my journey called life. And a huge example of that is in my relationship that I'm in now. So I'm married, have 4 kiddos, and my husband was what you would consider the statue of my trauma. Like, he represented my trauma in every form. He's Dominican.
Okay.
I met him in Dominican Republic. He was very much associated and close to that area and my family.
Yeah.
So when I became an adolescent, let's say 15 years old. So I met him when I was 12. And when I was 15, he came to the United States, and he was very much in love with me at the time. And I thought I knew what love was. You know, with teenagers, we think we know what we're talking about. And I just knew at that time that I didn't want to live a triggered life anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And because I didn't want to live a triggered life anymore, I was saying no to somebody who could have been safe simply because they looked and felt like someone who was not safe.
Mm.
And what that meant is that for about 13 years, I gave him the stiff arm. Football stiff arm. It's like, stay away, stay away. And he was very respectful, but at the same time, he would still throw pebbles on on my birthday. He would throw pebbles on Mother's Day. He would throw pebbles on any holiday he would remember. And he'd be like, hey, how are you doing? Happy such and such day.
Yeah.
And he would continue to do so from a respectful way and a distance. And I found myself in some pretty toxic situations in like relationships outside of him.
Right.
I was in a relationship with a narcissist. I was in a domestic violence relationship, and I was raped twice.
Oh.
All by different people.
Yeah.
And here I was giving this other person the stiff arm. So it wasn't until I experienced all of that powerlessness, and it was literally powerlessness. After that happened to me, one thing after another, I was done. I did not have it in me at the time to stand in my truth and in my power and know who I am. Like, who am I? I didn't think I was anybody. I felt like everything in me had been taken. Mm. And the way I responded at the time was, forget this. I'm going to take. I'm not caring about anyone's emotions. I'm not caring about anyone. So I found myself in a very chaotic time. And it lasted about a month.
Oh, okay.
It lasted about a month because during that time, I let my wall down enough for my husband to get close enough to me. So now I no longer had a stiff arm. And it was enough for him to get closer to me. And the interesting part was that during that time, I felt very out of control and chaos and just confused because I wasn't standing in my truth. I wasn't standing in my power.
Right.
I was living a lie to try to regain some power from a level of like an abuser standpoint.
Yeah. It's not really coming from the I don't even know what to call it, who you really are, right? Or really power. Yeah.
So it was really a way of me, like I wasn't in my element. So yeah, it felt wrong. It felt off. It felt confusing. It felt really off. And in my husband's arms, I felt peace. Hmm. So I had this contrast. I had chaos, peace, chaos, peace. And it was like a magnet that kept pulling me towards the peace, pulling me towards the peace. And I was very vocal about how I felt when I was with him. And I was able to use that to reflect, where are you going? And what is it that you want out of your life? Do you want chaos and confusion, or do you want peace?
At this point, had you shared any of your trauma with him? Did he know any of it?
No.
Okay.
At that point, he didn't. And again, it was like, and actually during that time, I was going to run away. I was going to run away from all of my problems. I was going to pack up my bags and move to California. And the reason why was because I didn't feel safe.
Yeah.
Where I experienced domestic violence, the guy broke into my house and came in through my window. And while I had this piece of paper that was telling me that you have to stay however many feet away, I didn't feel safe.
No.
So I felt like I needed to run. And in wanting to run away meant that I was running away from this piece as well. So I had to make a decision. I was at a crossroads. I had to decide whether I was going to run or whether I was going to stay with him. And I decided to stay. Hmm. And since then, I have been able to speak up about my trauma, speak up about my experiences, and he has accepted me wholeheartedly, which has allowed me to, again, just stand in my truth, find my voice, and live in my power. Because even in my relationship with him, I found myself being triggered. Because again, he has this image, right? And if I'm in a mental space that I am triggered, he could be my trigger. And these are some of the things that I had to communicate, that I feel uncomfortable right now. It's not you, it's me. My mind and my body just took me somewhere else where I don't feel comfortable, and I need to be able to speak and be heard. And that's the key for me to get out of my past. If I am able to speak up about being uncomfortable, and if I'm able to be heard in terms of not right now, then that's just enough to snap me back into the present.
It sounds like the triggers, as bad as that is, to feel triggered and to have that set off, that the voicelessness is worse.
Yes.
You can tolerate being triggered as long as you can stand up, say no, take control, of yourself.
What it is that the trigger coupled with voicelessness means that the suffering lasts longer than it needs to.
Right.
So trigger is something that is like almost like a knee-jerk reaction, like it just comes.
Right.
It just comes. And now the liberation is speaking.
Yeah.
So if I'm able to let it out, I'm able to reduce my suffering by now no longer being that voiceless child.
Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't sound like anyone else, like any of the other people you were involved with, had relationships with, had sex with, or anything, that nobody else was sensitive to this or alarmed by, like, wait a minute, maybe you're not really taking care of yourself, or saying no. Like, nobody else was noticing, right?
Well, I will say that the key to the idea of being with a narcissist and opening up to them about all of your
the narcissist wasn't going to ever.
That was going to be used as a weapon for sure.
Yeah.
And that was later used as, so you can imagine that one right there was very much weaponized and used against me. But in terms of other situations, I've been in situations where I've been taken advantage of and felt voiceless because it was this dynamic. It was a power dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't necessarily see it as alarming at the time because it felt normal. I was running away from this idea of being abused, but I was running into the arms of abusers just because they didn't symbolize my abuser.
Right. Right. So do you still get triggered?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just triggered the other day. I'll share. So I was processing, because I'm also an author. So I've been writing, and I just finished a co-authored project called Fire Starters. And in doing so, I brought myself back to that child, the inner child, and what I experienced. And I was able to connect with that inner child in a way that I never did before, is that I allowed the inner child to just sob and cry like a baby.
Yeah.
And what it was is that when I was a child and I experienced what I experienced, it wasn't acute, meaning it just didn't happen once or twice. It was chronic. It happened multiple times. So it was a normal, quote unquote, occurrence that was happening.
Yeah.
And when the memory came back to me, I was the guilty one. And I didn't talk about it. So I certainly couldn't cry about it, because what are you crying about?
Right.
If you didn't say anything is wrong, like, what are you crying about? So, and not actually allowing myself to cry meant that I had this inner child, it pent up inside of me, that was waiting to be released.
Yeah.
So I had this experience and I had this emotional release, and it was absolutely amazing. And for a second, I wanted to fast forward to the now. I wanted to be like, well, you're okay now. Well,
Yeah.
Look what you're doing now. And I told myself, I said, stop the tape right there. Feel this feeling. Allow yourself to be sad. Allow yourself to cry, and don't get over it. Just don't tell yourself to get over it. Just feel. And that liberation that I felt was absolutely amazing. But then that night, I come home and I'm talking to my husband and I'm telling him about this experience that I had. Now, he doesn't know what it's like to live with trauma. He thinks he'd like to know what it's like to live with trauma, but he really doesn't. And the only way that he knows is by me expressing how I feel. And it was a situation that intimacy was not a thing in that moment. I wasn't feeling it because I was not in a position to connect with my body in a healthy way because I was just mourning the innocence that my body no longer had as a child. Like it was a moment, and I was still in that moment, and he couldn't quite understand. So what it was like, okay, well, we don't have to do that. Maybe we can do something else. And again, it's like as women, sometimes we think that we have to please our husbands, or we think that we can say no in a passive way and not in an assertive way. Like consent. What does the consent mean? Like, are we really taught no is no? And like not, oh, well, I don't feel like it. Oh, well, my back hurts. I got a headache. Oh, maybe later. You know what I mean? Like there are different ways that we go about saying things that don't necessarily assert the no-ness in how we're feeling. So I was in one of those ambiguous consensual acts where I was kind of like, well, type of thing.
Right.
I ended up stopping, like mid-act. I was like, I'm done.
Yeah.
And I rolled over and I couldn't go to sleep because now I was in my head. And I didn't want to talk about my trigger in the moment just because I knew that it would absolutely take away my ability to go to sleep, even though not talking about it didn't mean I went right to sleep anyways. But I knew it was a conversation that we would be able to have the very next morning. I just didn't want to talk about it in the moment. I just wasn't in a space to talk. So the very next day, I started telling him about how I felt and how uncomfortable I was. And he was like, well, why didn't you just tell me that? I was like, well, I did say no the first time, but then you suggested something else. And that made me think like you didn't hear or understand or respect my no. And maybe we could do a better job at like understanding kind of different ways of communicating. So that way I don't feel that way. And it was a very powerful conversation where he was again able to get inside of my brain in terms of how trauma works. Because the way he felt as though it was like, well, I'm your husband and I would never do something like that to you.
Right.
So why can't you just see me for who I am? And I'm like, because trauma doesn't work that way.
Right. Right.
So it was again, like I said, an opportunity for us to be able to have that dialogue. And it was absolutely, it was amazing because we had, again, another breakthrough in another situation where he was able to understand what it was like for me.
Yeah.
And I'll actually tell you where my mind went at that time too, because it went back to when I was 10 years old, and I have a sister. She's older than me. And as an older sister, she actually experienced her own level of trauma. I can't speak for her story because I didn't live her shoes, but I just know that it exists. And she had this situation where anytime she had a boyfriend or wanted to go out with a boy, she would bring me along as a tag along, because if she was with me, she couldn't possibly be up to no good, because
Right.
I'm the good girl and I'm the little sister and she's just out with her sister, and So what it meant was I found myself in a dangerous situation.
Yeah.
And what it was that she brought me over to her boyfriend's house, and this was an older guy to me. I was 10. He was older. Obviously, my sister was maybe 4 or 5 years older than me. And they were very much bothered by the fact that I was there. Now I'm sitting there on the floor, watching SpongeBob on TV. I'm aging myself, SpongeBob.
Right.
So I was watching SpongeBob on TV, and he wanted me to get out because he wanted to do whatever they were planning on doing. So their brilliant idea was to call one of his friends over and have his friend take me into another room while my sister was with him. And I was in the living room with him, and then he brought me into the bathroom, and I was in a corner, just kind of like fetal position, just kind of like in that corner, not wanting to be touched. And he had his stuff out and was like, well, touch it. I'm not going to incriminate your hand. And that was the image that I had playing over and over in my head.
Yeah.
And while my husband and this guy were nothing alike,
right,
that was the feeling that I felt when it was like, oh, well, not that. Try to, no.
Right. Just do it. Yeah. No.
So when I explained where my head was at and what was the movie that was playing in my head, he was able to understand the impact. And it's like, for me, the moments where I can voice, that's when I'm able to separate from my trauma and feel liberated and be reminded of who I am.
Yeah.
And live in my power.
I so appreciate you sharing your story.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's, it's powerful, and it's an incredible road you've had and quite a distance you've gone. I hope it's going to feel like, I don't want to quite say inspiring. It seems like a trite word, but as people listen to this, and plenty of them will have had trauma, hopefully it's going to resonate with them, right? It's going to have an impact.
Absolutely. I recognize that my experience was not had in vain.
Yeah.
That as a communicator, which is one of my gifts that I have, which is to communicate, I will be able to inspire and help liberate others from the bondage of trauma by sharing my story, having the courage to share my story in its most candid way.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for taking the time and sharing it and with all of us. It means a lot.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.